Hello, and welcome to the All Things Narrative podcast, where we explore the relationships between the stories we love and the stories we live. I'm your host, Derrick, and let's get started. All right, everyone, welcome to another edition of Why We Love, where we take a popular franchise in our culture, in this case, two popular franchises, and we talk about what makes them so great, why we're drawn to them as people, and why after so many years these stories continue to move and inspire us. And today we got a double feature for you, a double header of two of the great stories and franchises of fantasy books and filmmaking. And so we are going to talk about today why we love Middle Earth and Narnia, aka the stories of Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings and the stories of C.S. Lewis and the Chronicles of Narnia. Before we get started, just want to remind you that if this is your first time listening, feel free to subscribe. Feel free to leave us a review if you enjoyed this episode. And we'd love to hear from you. Feel free to connect with us on allthingsnarrative.com. And yeah, let us know what you want to hear on the podcast and let us know what you think and if you've been enjoying it. And if you're a Lewis or a Tolkien fan, follow us on social media this week on our Facebook and on our Instagram, because we're going to do some posts and talk about some of our favorite moments. And we'd love to hear from you what your favorite Lord of the Rings and Narnia moments are. So feel free to let us know any of those ways that you choose. Without further ado, I would like to bring a special guest on this episode. Now, we don't have with us this week, we don't have Joseph and Jason. They're out for this one. And so I'm actually here right now at this moment. I am in Corfu, New York. If you don't know where Corfu is, it's right outside of Buffalo. And I am here with, honestly, the only person on earth that I would want to do this episode with. Someone who is a dear friend, but also someone who is passionate about the stories of Tolkien and Lewis. Everyone, let's give it up for the man, Ryan Mating. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for having me, Derrick.
Is this your first time ever on a podcast?
Ever.
Cool. This is exciting.
First time recorded in any form.
See, I already like having Ryan on because the moment before we got started, he's like, hey, I brought some Guinness. And I've never had Guinness before. I'm kind of embarrassed to admit that on here. So I'm sitting here having my first Guinness ever. And I love it, by the way. These like creamy, kind of stout-like beers, these are nice.
Oh, yeah.
So thank you.
Absolutely.
For turning me on to Guinness.
You got to have one around St. Patrick's Day.
That's true. Recording this around St. Patrick's Day. And as we'll see, as we dive into these wonderful, brilliant men, great things happen over drinks.
Absolutely.
So, all right, so what we usually like to do, Ryan, is we like to start off with a brief history of these franchises. Now, it's interesting because The Lord of the Rings and Narnia, their histories are very intertwined. And so we've got Lewis and Tolkien, who are students, and feel free to interrupt and join in as well as we do this. So we got Lewis and Tolkien, who are students at Oxford. And they're both, very passionate about literature. In fact, I just learned this week. I don't know if you ever heard this, but the first time they met, I believe they got into an argument. And their argument was about which one was worth pursuing, studying linguistics or studying in literature. Have you ever heard that before?
Yeah, I've actually heard about that. I couldn't verify if it was one of their first encounters with each other, but it's definitely a part of their relationship, right? They're kind of unique in that they're academics, right?
Yes. They're brilliant.
I don't know all the franchises that you're going to cover, but I can't imagine a lot of the authors are going to be academics as a background.
Yeah, and Tolkien was the one who was really into language. Mm-hmm. That linguistics, that was really his expertise. And we'll see later that words are something that he's very particular about. Whereas Lewis focused a lot more on literature. He actually wrote quite a few books outside of Narnia, nonfiction books, works of theology, and even works on literature and literary criticism and theory and all that stuff. Mm-hmm. So, yeah, these guys were awesome. Now, have you ever been to Oxford?
I have not.
Oh, no. See, I got to go about 7 years ago, and we went in the morning on like a bus tour, and right where they dropped us off on the bus was in front of this little place called the Eagle and Child. Mm. Now, the downside of that was that it was 9 o'clock in the morning. You couldn't go into the Eagle and Child at 9 o'clock in the morning.
You just had to wait for 9:30. They start doing
I wish. Oh, I know. I was so sad. I was like a puppy dog eyes, like just staring in the window like, I want to go in.
My only experience with the United Kingdom was in Scotland. I was visiting.
You have been to Scotland.
Yeah, I was visiting my uncle in Edinburgh.
Well, that's where Lewis is from, right? He's actually from Scotland. Or is he from Ireland?
I'm not sure. I think Ireland. He's Irish.
Yeah, okay. My bad.
I'm pretty sure he's Irish. Mm-hmm. But I got off the plane. It was early in the morning. I only had a couple of days. Mm-hmm. And so we started to see some things. Mm-hmm. And at, I think, 10:30, my uncle was ready for his first beer.
Really?
We went into the first pub. It was maybe 10 o'clock or something. And he was like, I just need to stop and get a drink. And we kept going back throughout the day.
Wow.
I mean, it's just so funny.
That pub life.
Yeah, it's just such a different culture.
It is. And it wasn't uncommon for Lewis and Tolkien to gather, there frequently. And to actually, it's almost, ironic because it's around the drinking and this social atmosphere of the pub that they actually swapped a lot of their great ideas with each other. Mm-hmm. So I believe Lewis got to read a manuscript of The Hobbit, right? Like some of the early pieces, and even Lord of the Rings. And I think there's a story about Lewis almost being moved to tears because he knew that what Tolkien was writing was going to be big.
It was special.
Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Absolutely. And, you had this group of guys who were just exchanging stories, right? Mm-hmm. It wasn't fleshed out. It started out small, and they helped each other build it up. And it's just special to see that bond, right? You're working through something together. I mean, if you've ever been a part of a team, you know what that's like to help each other grow and to refine something.
Totally.
And you had this community of people who often met in a pub and sat and chatted and shared their stories with one another.
And as they did that, they found they had a lot in common too, because they were both in World War I. Mm-hmm. And I do think that's where some of their inspiration for maybe battles and those types of physical conflicts comes from. They both lost their mothers as well at pretty young ages, I believe. Mm-hmm. And that profoundly shaped them. And they both had obviously equal passions for words and for literature and reading and stories and all that stuff. And I know Lewis taught at Oxford. Did Tolkien teach there as well?
He did.
Okay.
Philology. Which is language.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. So it's cool that they had a lot of things in common. And Lewis was a huge fan of Tolkien, just even as they were friends. He was just a huge fan of what he was doing. But their conversations eventually became a lot more than just literature, because we know that Tolkien, who had a very Catholic background, was introducing C.S. Lewis to the world of theism and theology, because Lewis was an atheist at the time. Mm-hmm. And it's through their conversations that eventually Lewis converts to theism, and then eventually a form of Protestant Christianity.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that's such a unique thing about their relationship and their works as well, is because they are two people who were deeply interested in story, deeply interested in language and philosophy as a byproduct of that.
Yeah.
But they were also really deeply interested in religion.
Yeah.
And that really formed most of everything they did.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it became so important that it's in the stories. It's baked into them. Yeah. And it's actually very ironic because when Lewis began sharing his ideas about Narnia, Tolkien actually wasn't quite a fan of it.
He was a critic.
He was a critic, to say the least. And I think part of that was, they had very different ways of how they integrated theology and their beliefs into their writings, Lewis, I would say, is a little more on the nose, a little more forward with his imagery. But as we're going to talk about in a moment, I don't think he was as intentionally allegorical as people make him out to be. But nonetheless, they had very, for as many shared beliefs that they eventually came to have, they had very different ways of executing them. And so Tolkien, tell me if you think this is a fair description. I once heard that Tolkien really values, obviously words and language and very like deep philosophy. He wants that philosophical depth, into the stories. Whereas Lewis, he seems to start with an image. He seems to be more of an image person because he talks about the image of the fawn with an umbrella or the lamppost in the snow. He talked about how it started with these images, or the girl Lucy, who was inspired by a real life girl in his life. It started with these images, and images kind of he would play around with these images in his mind. And, that's what he was more concerned about, was creating a detail sort of, and a story around those images and details. I don't know. Do you think that description's kind of fair to say about how they're a little different?
Maybe to some extent, but you have to remember that Tolkien kind of starts that way too, right? That's the beginning of his work in this world. Mm-hmm. Tolkien starts his writing in a hole in the ground there lived a hobbit.
Oh, yeah. So
not
good.
A nasty, dirty, wet hole filled with the ends of worms and an oozy smell, nor yet a dry, bare, sandy hole with nothing in it to sit down on or to eat. It was a hobbit hole, and that means comfort. And I think Tolkien will talk about that being the starting point for him, right?
Yeah.
He came up with that, and then he expanded. And Tolkien, as he expanded, seemed to be really deeply interested in his religious faith, his Catholic background, his Catholicism, and you can see that interwoven every step.
Yeah,
Tolkien has a pretty big plan for his stories, and some people will push back and say that Lewis didn't.
Yeah,
and I would say go and read Michael Ward's work. Right? I haven't read it all. I've read parts of it. I don't know if you've heard about it, Derrick.
Yeah,
but he gives a pretty good account, from what I understand, of it being very coherent. So I don't know. I think they're both working in similar ways, but there is definitely a different flavor.
Yeah, I think Lewis's work, I don't necessarily think he's making it up as he goes, but I also, and we'll talk about this when we get into the mythology a little bit, but I do think that he maybe had a certain idea of how far it was going to go and then wanted to take it further, and that forced him to kind of add things to the mythology. But we'll get there in a moment. Before I want to dive into the mythology, I'd love to just kind of know, what was your personal introduction to these worlds of Middle Earth and Narnia?
Well, I can't think of the exact date, but Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe came out in the 50s, right? I mean, it's been out for a while. My mother was born in 57. So if it gives you some perspective, I mean, it was released, it was before she was born.
Okay.
So she read it when she was a child.
Yeah.
When she was within 10 years of age or so. And it was important for her that I read it, that my siblings and I read it. So that was the first story for either of them that I really got engaged with. Yeah. And then I read the rest of Narnia. And I didn't touch either of them from there for a few years. And then I picked up The Hobbit first because it's it's a classic. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
It's easy to get into because everyone knows it. Yeah. And I just fell in love, right? I love Tolkien's emphasis on this hobbit life, right?
Yeah.
This small community of people. Yeah. It really captured my mind.
Yeah. That's good. How
about you?
My introduction was for Narnia. It was in elementary school, and it was just being in the library. You got to have a good library, good school library. One of my favorite things to do in the week was they would just let us wander in the library and just look at books and just kind of see what was interesting to you. And I can't remember which Narnia book in particular caught my attention, but I do remember being drawn to them, drawn to the imagery on the covers and whatnot, and just thinking, ooh, I'd really like to read these, I don't remember. I might have read The Magician's Nephew first, because I would have, knowing myself in elementary school, if I would have seen one, like book one, I have to read book one. Just like with the Hardy Boys and all those books, it's like, oh, I have to read the first one. Even if, the series doesn't go in order, I have to know, Mm-hmm. So I'm pretty sure I read The Magician's Nephew first. And then I probably read The Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. And I read The Silver Chair. Those are the only three I read in elementary school. And then it was my freshman year of high school that the Narnia, or right before my freshman year, a year before, when the Narnia movie came out, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe movie. And I was in love with it. And people don't understand at the time how huge that movie was if you weren't there, And I remember I was in the high school band, and for my freshman year of marching band, our show was Narnia. Like, we literally had a wardrobe that was built, and like the color guard would go in the wardrobe, and we played the music from Narnia.
That is awesome.
And that's why I fell in love with it. It's one of my favorite movie soundtracks, because I had to learn that soundtrack, and I just fell in love with it. It was just so gorgeous. Absolutely. And so epic at the same time.
Yeah, it was a big deal that these movies came out when we were relatively young, right?
Well, and even the Lord of the Rings movies, which is, okay. This is like confession time, because I'm really embarrassed for what I'm about to tell you. Please forgive me. So the first Lord of the Rings movie came out, and I was like it came out in 2001, 2002, something like that. Totally, yeah. I wasn't super interested in it at the time. The Two Towers had come out, and it was in theaters. And my uncle was who's a big literary guy, was like, oh, we gotta go see The Two Towers in theaters. I'm like, but I haven't even seen The Fellowship of the Ring. He's like, it's okay. Let's just go. And I was so bored out of my mind, because I knew nothing. I had no context for what was happening. And I think The Two Towers, I still stand by that it's the worst of the three films in the trilogy.
It drags.
It drags.
Is that your point?
Yes.
Well, especially if you don't know it.
And if you don't know it, it's fine now. I enjoy it now. But if you don't know what's going on, whew. And so I think it's the only time in my entire life I've ever fallen asleep in a movie theater. So that left a bad taste in my mouth. I think I just wasn't as interested. It was just bad timing. But when I got into Narnia Lord of the Rings a few years later, that was a whole different ballgame. And same with The Hobbit as well. So, yeah, I think this is a good time where we can kind of dive into the mythology a little bit here.
Sure.
So both Lewis and Tolkien have this belief that myth is representative of the deepest truths of the universe. And so they talk about how myth isn't fake or fiction. Myth is a way of expressing what's real, and myth is, and this is kind of like Joseph Campbell type of stuff, is that myth is an aspect that helps us understand who we are, where we are, how we got here, and where we're going. Like Lewis talks about, I actually, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the crux of the argument that Tolkien used to win Lewis into theism was that Jesus is the myth made real. Like the myth in history, that it actually happened, it took place, right? It's all these mythological stories that come together in a real life person and event, right? Correct?
Yeah, and so for Tolkien, he was raised in this Catholic tradition. And it seems that was always an important part of his life, whereas in Lewis, it wasn't, right? We've already discussed he was an atheist for a majority of his young adult life.
Yeah.
And then changed atheism into Christianity.
Right.
But they both loved stories. And I imagine that they had some struggle with this because Christianity wasn't very kind to mythology. At least it wasn't when I was growing up. And I don't think it would have been any better for them. I don't know. I haven't read anything on that. But, Paul talks a lot about stop listening to these myths. You know? But for the two of them, they were able to see that these stories, although they aren't true, they hold glimpses of truth. Yeah. And that was important.
And when you say they're not true, as in like they're not like historically
They're not historical.
True.
Correct.
Right.
That they are, they're not historical accounts like they say Christianity is. Right. So for them, they distinguish that, but they say, even though these stories aren't historically true and aren't always theologically accurate or morally accurate, they hold pieces of the truth.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's a big part of their understanding of story.
Yes.
Is that they point back to the true myth as Tolkien talks about. Right. They hold a glimpse of what is true and good.
And let's dive into that. Let's dive into the specific ways that they really did that. So we'll give him the right of way to go first, since he was kind of the first with this. But maybe we'll spend some time talking about the mythology of Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth, and I think out of that we can go to Narnia at some point as well.
Sure.
But yeah, so I can imagine this is where we'll probably spend the bulk of our conversation here.
I can imagine so.
But yeah, okay, so go ahead and walk us through a little bit, like for anyone who's listening who maybe doesn't really know much about the world of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, like maybe in like 2 to 3 minutes, how would you describe kind of the central story, the narrative that's taking place?
Well, like I said earlier, I think it's important to remember how Tolkien starts with, there's a hole in the ground, right? That starts his story. And I think that's important in the sense of keeping in mind that he wrote this for his own children. Yeah. Right. We talk about it as kind of this deep theological, philosophical type story. Yeah. And he started it as a way to engage with his children. And it expands drastically.
Was The Hobbit written like more directed towards children, or was The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, or was the Lord of the Rings more adult?
Oh, he definitely distinguishes that The Hobbit is a children's book. Okay. Not that it doesn't hold great truths and it doesn't do dramatic things. Yeah. But it is written for children. It's written for his own children. Right. And then Lord of the Rings, he fell in love with this world. Yeah. And so he realized that there was a need to expand it and to really put depth to it, because he knew that there was depth to this story. And that was, I think that's part of what you talk about, the difference between Lewis and Tolkien, is Tolkien wanted to really flesh out every corner of his world. Yeah. But to get back to kind of summarizing that, you have this children's story that is, it's just kind of, it's fun. It is a lot of fun, right? Oh, yeah. There's dragons, there's orcs, there's goblins, there's enemies, there's things going on. There's an adventure. He recognized that these conflicts with these with the villains, this adventure for young kids was so important. Yeah. And so The Hobbit really kind of sets the stage for him to go in depth and to really make a more philosophical, more religious works in Lord of the Rings. So the Lord of the Rings starts with the Shire. It starts with Frodo and Samwise and Bilbo, and Gandalf shows up, and you have all that kind of that, like, Tolkien loved that little world, the Shire, right? Yeah, and he talks about, I'm just a hobbit. I love being here in this little world, just drinking my beer, tilling the ground, planting things, enjoying the earth, and just having a quiet life. He loved that aspect. So you kind of start in this ideal place, at least for Tolkien. Yeah. And then I would say probably the thing that motivates the story as a whole is Tolkien's idea of eucatastrophe. Have you heard of that, Derrick?
Yes.
Okay. Do you know much about it?
No.
Okay. Tolkien says, all of a sudden I realized what it was, this idea of eucatastrophe that he's going to describe. The very thing I have been trying to write about and explain, the sudden turn in the story which pierces you with a joy that brings tears. And I was there led to the view that it produces its particular effect because it is a sudden glimpse of truth. That is kind of... I haven't read autobiographies of Tolkien. I don't know some of those depths, but I'm just a fan of the things he's written.
Yeah.
And this seems to be one of the things that really drives the story of that. You start in this happy, idealistic place. You have this journey, which is a long journey. As you talked about in the Two Towers, it kind of drags, right? It's a long journey. And then you get to this point where things are dire. Things are bad.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, something happens that brings great joy.
Right. And that direness, I'm assuming, are you referring to the ring and what the ring brings to this world?
Well, and one of the unique things about Tolkien is he weaved it in so many different ways, right? The ring, but also Gandalf and Moria at the bridge and facing the demon and dying, and disappearing into the darkness, and he's gone, right? Like that's a moment. And then he shows up in the forest, right? Yeah. He's reborn, so to speak.
Yeah.
And he comes back, and that's that moment of great joy. But then also when the ring is destroyed and they're saved by the eagles, or when Aragorn is crowned king, like there's so many aspects, and I mean, there's 100 more that you could go into.
Sure.
The story just keep bringing that idea back into it, and he pulls that back to Christ, of this idea of the sudden joy of things are dire,
right,
and then it changes in an instant,
right? Yeah, and the cool thing about like the mythology of the Lord of the Rings is it brings together so many mythological elements to it. Like you've got a world in Middle Earth where there's elves and dwarves and people and the orcs, which and the goblins and magicians and wizards, and even these like demonic figures. And so you've got these, you've got Sauron, who creates these rings and gives 3 rings to the elves, and the elves are kind of higher in the hierarchy of Middle Earth. I think he gives 5 or 7 to the dwarves, something like that.
I don't know off the top of my head.
And then when the dwarves are kind of in the middle, and then man gets only like they get like 9 or something like that, because they're the most fragile and they're defined by their mortality. So they get these rings, but these rings kind of come with something attached to them, and it's that the rings, they're linked to the power of Sauron. And Sauron is, I don't know, what would you consider him to be? Like
he's kind of I don't know. Probably like an angelic being is like a good, like a familiar word maybe for us to describe him. Yeah.
And so, of course, there's power in these rings. But what Sauron does is he infuses his power into one particular ring that is the one ring to rule them all. And it's this ring that is highly coveted by everybody else. Because if you have that one ring, you can rule all, not just your people, you can rule all the tribes. But the thing about a ring, and the kind of the symbolism of the ring, is that a ring binds you to something, right? So when we're married, we have wedding rings on right now. The ring, the power in it is that it binds us to another person. And in the same way, the ring binds these people to Sauron. It creates this connection. And with Sauron being like this representation of darkness and evil, it binds you to that. And it begins to almost like you enter like a covenant with Sauron. And that covenant could be, for example, you could turn invisible. You can hide. You can cloak yourself. You can mask yourself so that way you're protected. But in return of that, what do you see? You see this other world that exists. And you see Sauron at the heart of that world. And you hear Sauron. And you're linked to this connection with the spiritual. So you get this power. You get this cloaking. You get these things out of it. But it draws you into a world that no creature is ready to handle or prepared for. I don't know. How's that? Is that kind of...
Yeah, I think it's interesting because in the starting of the story, you have these elves, you have these dwarves, you have these human kings who are accepting of these things.
Yes,
right? And
that is interesting.
Right, I haven't read the Lost Tales and the histories, which are quite deep. But for some reason, they were accepting of these rings.
Yeah.
And that is kind of interesting to me because Sauron is not, he's kind of this deceptive figure.
Right.
He's not outright known to be bad, or these elves aren't foolish people. They wouldn't have accepted this.
Yeah.
But he deceives them.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of an interesting thing is you're bound with people because the way that he kind of pulls them in to just deceive them is right. Like that hurts.
Right.
Think about, you use the imagery of marriage with rings, right? When you're married to someone and they deceive you, that is painful.
Yeah.
And, if that gives you kind of a correlation of like the betrayal that happens, it's really, it puts a lot of depth to the story.
Right. Well, and like for the men, for example, these 9 kings, they forfeit their humanity. That image is so powerful, and we'll talk about how Lewis uses that similar imagery as well. But how they forfeit that which makes them human, that which makes them unique and special in Middle Earth. And that's kind of what Sauron does. That's what he does is he says, I'm going to give you these rings to rule your people, but ironically, it will alienate you from your people.
Well, and ironically, it offers them long life, right? Eternal life.
Yeah.
But that is not a gift.
Right.
That wasn't a gift to them.
It's the curse of eternal life.
Right? Like the elves are jealous. And in the world of Middle Earth, the elves are jealous that men get to die.
Yeah.
And that's so fascinating.
It is very fascinating. Yeah.
But the men cling to this idea of not dying, which is so true of our world, right?
Yeah,
like we don't want to die. And we think it's a curse to die.
Yeah.
But part of Tolkien's work is to emphasize that at least in this world right now, it's a gift.
Yeah.
Which is it's weird. Right? Like who else is talking about that?
Yeah.
We all want to be all powerful and to live forever. But Tolkien says, no, that's not the right way.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something about death. And like one of the things that really moves me, I just rewatched The Fellowship of the Ring last week. And it's so moving when Boromir at the end of the Fellowship, and Boromir is currently like the king. He's the king of like one of the groups of humans, right? One of the groups of men.
Right. He's part of his father's the steward.
Right.
Gondor.
Yes.
Which is
because we know Aragorn is the rightful king.
Correct.
But they don't know where he's been.
Right.
So Boromir, though, he has this moment before his death where because the ring makes people kind of act crazy.
Oh yeah.
And so poor Frodo. We'll talk about Frodo in a second. But you see Boromir wants the ring and he's trying to get it, but he like realizes he's so ashamed after he tries to kind of jump to take the ring by force. And it's like his death scene is so moving at the end of Fellowship of the Ring because there's almost this sense that like there's a peacefulness about his death because, he's taking those arrows. He's taking that in. And he's like, no, like, don't take them out, And there's this almost like this thought I had of like, man, he resisted the ring. He was in the presence of the ring. And he is dying with his humanity intact. He is dying uncorrupted. And that's what makes him ultimately, like a good king.
Right. And that's kind of the eucatastrophe, right? Like he is envious. He wants that ring. Right? He's going to go to no end to get that ring. And then he snaps out of it.
Yeah.
And he's killed. But even though he was killed, you have that redemption.
Yes.
Which is that bizarre kind of melding of terrible things with good things.
Yeah.
That happens throughout the story.
Yeah.
One of the things that's interesting about the ring and what I think Tolkien is doing with it is that it's not necessarily a possessing thing.
Yeah.
But that it's pulling out things within the people.
Oh, interesting.
So like it's pulling out that greed in Boromir.
Which is why like even there's the elf woman, I forget her name. But
Galadriel, I'm guessing. The white one? The tall white?
Yeah.
Galadriel.
And she has that moment where she puts herself purposefully in the presence of the ring to see if she can,
She says, I failed.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And that sucks if you live eternally because, like, man, you got to deal with that forever.
Yeah.
You got to, like, constantly resist that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure that's exhausting.
Yeah.
But, yeah. That's a good way to put it.
Right. It's an interesting part of it. And that's what Gandalf talks about, the importance of Frodo.
Yeah.
Is that he is able, not perfectly, as you see throughout the story, he fails.
Yeah.
But he has a fairly pure heart.
Yeah. And that's kind of the wonderful thing about the hobbits is they're not caught up in this conflict of power. They're kind of a content tribe. They're content with their lot. They value a simple life. In a lot of ways, we look at the hobbits and we say, man, I wish life could be like that, And that's what makes them so perfect for that.
Right. And go ahead.
And so, like, have you ever read, like, Joseph Campbell?
I have not.
But have you heard of him before?
I mean, I've heard the name, but I could tell you little.
He's like the hero's journey guy, Yeah. So I'm reading his book right now, The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And
when did he write this?
1949, I think.
Okay, so it's been a little bit.
So yeah, it has right before Narnia and right as Lord of the Rings, But so he talks about like how a myth, a story of this caliber has kind of three distinct acts or phases to it. So act or phase one or whatever you want to call it is the departure. 2 is the initiation and 3 is the return. And you could very nicely slice the Lord of the Rings trilogy down this line. So like Fellowship of the Ring being the departure, the Two Towers, the initiation, and Return of the King literally is the return, Mm-hmm. But, I'll take this example here with the Fellowship of the Ring because I think it fits so well. Is like there's like 5 kind of phases within the departure. So like there's the call to adventure. So we have Gandalf discovering the ring, that Bilbo has it, and then Frodo now being in possession of the ring, right? So that's the call that Frodo, you have this ring, now you got to run. And then there's almost that like there's a phase called, it's like the refusal of the call, like, I don't know if I can do this, that initial doubt, hesitancy about it that we know that Frodo faces. And Gandalf is, of course, the guide figure, the supernatural aid, and we have people like Bilbo who give him the, what's the thing underneath?
The
yeah,
armor.
That's it. And you've got the elves that give him something. So you've got these figures early on in the story that give him things that are going to aid him on his journey. And then you've got the crossing of the first threshold, which is where that's like your moment where you officially transition from the familiar world to the unfamiliar world. This could be Frodo staying at that inn, and that's where he meets Aragorn, and Aragorn's like, you can't go back, like it's, you're severing those ties,
right?
There's no going back. You have to, the orcs are coming. We have to run. And then the belly of the whale, which is where like you kind of go to this place, a dark place, if you will, where you've experienced, like a loss of some sort. So, you think of Jonah with like the belly of the whale. And it's like this period where you're trying to figure out how you're going to do this. And so after Gandalf dies, we see Frodo mourning, and we see that Boromir wants the ring, and Frodo in the belly of the whale, in that pit of despair, he decides he needs to go out on his own. And that's eventually what will lead him into the next book, and also the next phase as well, where he'll face all the trials and the initiation and all that stuff. So,
yeah, and I think part of what's driving Tolkien, everything that's driving Tolkien is, as we've said before, his Catholic faith.
Yeah,
and part of what's important there is his idea, his understanding that in the Christian life, suffering is important.
Yeah.
It is an important part of the journey.
Yes.
And I think that's kind of what you're touching on a little bit.
Yeah, and it's really cool that you even have, like in Joseph Campbell, someone who's not a Christian, someone who has dedicated his life to understanding stories and myth around the world. And it's right there that Joseph Campbell is saying that's inevitable. That's a piece of the story and what makes the story meaningful. And it's hard for us to admit that, right? I say this in my workshops. It's hard for us to admit that when our lives face sorrow and tragedy and suffering, because we're like, no, I don't want that. But that's actually what story is made of. And if our lives are telling stories, then should we really be surprised when we face these things?
Yeah, it seems to be. It's funny that we get caught off guard.
Yeah. So, anything else about the mythology of Lord of the Rings that we got to add before we kind of transition into Narnia?
I think that's a fair introduction, right?
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. For the scope of this.
Sure. Good. Awesome. Transitioning over to Narnia, and we'll come back to Middle Earth in a bit. To kind of give a little bit about Narnia's mythology. So Narnia is a little different because there's a long-standing debate, to say the least, in Lewis and Narnian circles of, do you read the books in chronological order, according to the box, or do you read them in publication order?
Correct.
So when I was over at your place last night, I saw that you had them in publication order.
Which is the way I was
Which raised. Is the way you were raised.
Right.
Oh, man.
But Lewis himself says read them in chronological order.
Right. Yes.
So,
and that's what I did when I did my deep dive into Narnia. I did read them in chronological. I think next time I will read them in publication order just to see what the experience is like.
What I like about the publication order is that you go through these first 5 books.
Yes.
And then you get to The Magician's Nephew.
Yeah.
And
that's what
really
everybody says.
It's like, it just opens up things to it. Whereas when you start with that, it's still great.
Yeah.
But you have that from the beginning, and then you go through the other things. I love that kind of surprise.
Well, yeah, and it's a prequel, and it's designed to be a prequel. Yeah. It's not necessarily designed to be the first book. It's meant to be like, oh, I've been in this world. Let's go back.
Yeah.
One of the things, and I kind of alluded to that, I was going to mention this when I said this earlier. So, like, the first 3 books he writes, Lion, Witch, Wardrobe, Prince Caspian, and Voyage of the Dawn Treader.
Okay.
I'm convinced that was his original trilogy idea.
Why?
Because Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, I almost tell people that I almost feel like Lewis shot himself in the foot with starting out with that story, because you tell in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe the most epic story about, the death and resurrection of the king. You're telling the story of Jesus in your first book, and I still think that, like, for me, there is no other Narnia story that is as epic. Even,
it is hard to beat.
It's hard to top it. It really, and even like the movie, it's hard to top that movie. I'm like, how are you going to do that better? But then you get Prince Caspian, which is really about like the restoration of, the true faith and religion after it's been corrupted, which I'll talk about how in a second. And then you've got Voyage of the Dawn Treader, which is about how do I really live out the spiritual life
That's
even
when Eustace comes in, right?
Even to the yes, and even to the point of death, because Voyage of the Dawn Treader ends with that beautiful statement, and I'll kind of mention this, and I'll kind of go backwards into the mythology from here. But it ends with, these two kids who have been in Narnia through the 3 books, and Aslan's telling them, you can't come anymore. Your time here is over. And it ends with, when you go back to your world, are you there too, sir? I am, but there I have another name. You must learn to know me by that name. This was the very reason you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little, you may know me better there. So, and he goes on to say more, but I feel like that kind of ending of Voyage of the Dawn Treader, where they're heading into Aslan's country, that really feels like the end of a trilogy. That kind of feels like the culmination of those characters and that story. And I feel like everything else we get in Narnia is bonus. It fleshes it out. It better helps me better understand the world. And it's fun to go forward. I like the Silver Chair. I like the Last Battle. I enjoy those stories. But I feel like maybe Lewis had that trilogy kind of in mind. So, but then he went forward into it. I don't know. What are your thoughts on that?
And I wonder if that's a bit of our feelings towards writings now. Right?
Yeah.
Things are written with an intentional plot line.
Right.
Or,
right.
And sometimes they're not, right? I know you're a big comic book fan, right?
Yeah.
And so you have all these different authors bringing things in. You don't always have this big storyline. You have
of
little
one
things.
Man's vision. Yeah.
Right. But when we're talking about things think about Harry Potter, you have someone who seemingly had it laid out.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was Lewis's intention.
Yeah. Yeah.
And maybe it was.
Yeah. I don't know if it was either.
Is that good or bad? Those are some of the things as you're starting to think about critiquing works, not saying bad things about it, but just starting to try and understand it more. Is it good or bad if he had a overview of it, or did he kind of do it piece by piece?
Sure. Yeah.
You should read Michael Ward's.
I know, now I want to.
You really should, because I think you'd find it interesting. I haven't read it entirely. I've read parts of it, but he talks about Lewis's vision for the 7 planets of the old mythological idea of the 7 planets, and I couldn't even list them off to you, but
right.
And those are the 7 books of Narnia. He gives
I've never heard that interpretation before.
Yeah, he gives a very good.
Oh,
I
wow.
mean, he's a Lewis scholar.
Yeah,
that's what he does.
That's
so
cool.
You should read that. I think it would be interesting.
Yeah, I do want to.
And he faces the same thing as what you're saying. Is for so long, people have had a hard time figuring out how this is one big package.
Sure.
So
I mean,
it's not
at the end of the day,
there.
it's just worth diving in and enjoying and feasting on it, you know? For those... Oh, go ahead.
I think what's interesting about what Lewis is doing is not necessarily whether he's trying to convey a perfect arc between book 1 and 7, but that there's important things for him in terms of what is true that he's bringing into each book.
He definitely has an idea, of kind of what he wants to communicate. So, you've got the magician's nephew, and it's this very, very Genesis parallels,
Absolutely.
and, you've got the story of starting off in London, and you've got these 2 children, Diggory and Polly, right? And, they find these magic rings, and that brings them into the wood between the worlds. And then first world they actually end up in is the land of Char. And that's where they see all these statues. And I hope, Magician's Nephew is really something I hope to see on the big screen or the small screen one day. I'd love to see how, Jadis, how she completely annihilated her own home planet. That's just savage. But already, she's just a really intimidating villain just from her backstory alone before she even does anything in this universe. But we know that, they ring the bell. the bell that's just sitting there, and it's just like, oh, I gotta ring the bell. And of course that brings her out, and that actually brings her to London, which is really interesting about Magician's Nephew, is you see not the land of Narnia necessarily, but you see the mythology in the real world, right, and you see them intersecting, which is one of the things I really have always enjoyed about that book.
Well, and I think that's what Tolkien critiques a little bit, is that like you've brought this into the real world.
He's not a fan of.
But it seems like Lewis's point is that these stories that are fictional are a part of the real world.
I totally see that. Yep,
what's going on?
I totally get that vibe too.
I think that's what, to agree with what he's doing is saying, yes, these are written stories that he's come up with, but they are reflecting what's going on.
Yes, and I think both of them have good points in what they're trying to set out to do there. Yeah. But when they go back, when they try to bring her back to that land, they actually end up accidentally going to a different world, and we see in one of my favorite sequences in the 7 books is Aslan creating Narnia. And do you listen to the Grey Havens at all? The band? No. Have you heard of them? I think I've heard of them, but I don't know. Oh, they're fantastic. I mean, they write songs about Lewis and Tolkien, and obviously with a name like that, Grey Havens, but they have a great song about Aslan creating the universe.
We'll have to listen to it.
It's really cool. But I love that sequence of Aslan singing creation, singing Narnia into being. And it's so beautiful how Lewis writes that.
Oh yeah.
And then we've got Jadis who's trying to kill Aslan with this pole, and it just hits Aslan and it doesn't even faze him. And that becomes the lamppost. I love the weapon that she uses will become the instrument to which the people that will defeat her will come into the world. And that actually leads me to probably what my favorite thing about the mythology of Narnia is. And it has to do with Lion, Witch, and the Wardrobe, but this is other books, obviously. This is a huge theme in them as well. But I love the idea that, so Diggory and Polly, they find this fruit that they need to take back to heal his mom, and they take, there's a tree that's planted to keep Jadis out of there, and the tree of protection. And I think Diggory takes a part of that tree and makes the wardrobe, right? Or something like that.
Correct.
But the tree in Narnia dies, and that's where Jadis comes in, and she creates the eternal winter, where it's always winter and never Christmas, as the great Reliant K song also says.
Absolutely.
But so there's this winter, and I love this image of just an eternal winter, because it would suck. You know me, I'm a wimp in this winter of Buffalo here.
Yeah.
So, you guys might be able to deal with an eternal winter, but I can't. So I need some sunshine. So you have this winter that goes on for 100 years, and the only thing they have is a promise. But it's interesting because the promise is not necessarily that Aslan is going to fix everything. The promise is that when a son of Adam and a daughter of Eve sit on the throne, that's when things will be made right. Now, Aslan is the one who, of course, ensures that happens. The children come in through the wardrobe one by one, Lucy and Edmund and Susan and Peter. They come in to Narnia. And we know that Jadis already has that plan with Edmund to try to get Edmund over, and lures and tempts him into that place, and caters to the jealousy and the things that he's feeling. But we know that Aslan's goal is to make it so that happens, that human beings will set the world right again. And I think you see where I'm going with this. That even to the point where Aslan will trade his life to the White Witch so that one of those human beings who's guilty and sinful and all that he could go free, so that promise could still be fulfilled. And that, to me, is one of my favorite ways of understanding the story of Jesus, is that the story of Jesus is about setting the world right again. So, and N.T. Wright talks a lot about this, so that human beings can take their place of properly, running this world.
Right.
As a new humanity, as redeemed. That's why Edmund's redemption is so beautiful in Lion, Witch, Wardrobe in that book, because he changes. He changes because of his encounter with Aslan, because of what Aslan's willing to do. And it makes him a very good character, especially when you get to Voyage of the Dawn Treader and you've got Eustace. And Eustace is kind of like a similar version of Edmund, of how he used to be. And Edmund is able to show this grace towards Eustace, So.
Well, and that's one of the things that almost bothers me when I hear people talk about it. I wish God would come and set this straight.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
Because I think God is saying, you need to be the people, the type of people who are going to set this straight.
Let's
right?
go.
Like, I'm coming.
Yeah.
And certainly my work is doing this.
Yeah.
But you have to want this. You have to be the type of people who want this. And Edmund had to be the type of person to change.
And he had to have that transformation in order to rightfully rule Narnia. And that's why it's like this amazing period in Narnian history, because these four, they've gone through the hero's journey. It's a great Narnia and both in Middle Earth as well. It's the perfect bringing together of and some people might be offended when I say this, but it's the perfectly way of bringing together, the Judeo-Christian understanding of creation in the world and all that, and kind of the more mythological hero's journey, even pagan understanding of it. Mm-hmm. And it brings these images and these ideas together in one place and says that they can exist together. And I know Lewis and Tolkien both believed that they could. Right. And so I think it's so beautiful the way they tie these things together. And this is my tangent here. It bothers me so much, when and I get it, because there's different things that different people can be offended by, but I know in a lot of Christian circles, they'll look at something and they'll say, oh, there's a witch in there. There's magic in there. And you just rub that off. You write that off because you're just like, oh, I don't see it. But Lewis and Tolkien are just masters of showing us it's not about magic. That's not really what the story's about. There's this they're using these images that have been pervasive throughout cultures and time and history. They're using these ideas together to tell stories of what's true and meaningful.
Well, and what's important to them is to redeem these stories.
And to redeem, absolutely.
Right? Because, they go into these pagan stories and they acknowledge that there's things that aren't good within them, but there are beautiful things within them. There's those glimpses of truth that we've been talking about. And they both see that Christ is going to redeem all of this. Yeah. Use it for his glory. And so they were painstaking work to use this for his glory.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is fascinating. And I think it shows a depth of their understanding of history, of philosophy. Right. They are smart men. Yeah. Right. I don't have any critique against, I know you just did a podcast on Batman. Yeah. I don't have any critique about those authors. Right. But I don't know much about them, but I can't imagine they have the depth of understanding that these two men had. Yeah. And they're both important in their own right. But Lewis and Tolkien understood what was happening throughout history and throughout these different cultures and through their mythologies, and bringing them to what they could define as what is true. Yeah. They really were students of these things. Yeah. And it's why, sometimes Narnia in particular, I know Narnia gets picked on a lot more for this. Sometimes Narnia is too Christian for non-Christians, and sometimes it's too pagan for Christians, Yeah. And I encourage people to really just try to ask yourself when you read these stories, are the ideas, the themes,
are they true of what it means to be human?
Right.
And I think, and you do that with Tolkien as well, in Lord of the Rings. And I think that's one of the reasons why we're so drawn to them, is because they echo things that we experience. They echo that deeper myth, you know?
Well, and I've been reading some Dallas Willard recently.
Yeah.
And one of the things he was talking about was the difference between the change of the heart versus the working of the law.
Yeah, yeah.
And the reason I'm bringing this up is because I think it's easier for people to come to these works and say, all right, there's a witch involved. Yeah. This isn't good. I'm going to avoid it.
Or on the other side to say, oh, Aslan's a Jesus figure. I don't like that.
Right.
That's indoctrination. That's, this or that.
Whereas when you go to Dallas, he is really trying to say, you need to be able to work through some of these things and come to terms with them in your heart, right? Like, it could be bad.
It could be.
Mm-hmm. But don't just push things off because it's easier.
Yeah.
Work through things.
Yeah, absolutely. And even having the understanding that no matter what you read, no matter what stories you consume, the author's worldview is on display.
Absolutely.
It doesn't matter what you read. You're getting their perspective, their worldview, because it's impossible not to write and include that. And that's why Lewis was just very big on it's not like, I'm not intentionally making an allegory. I'm just telling a story of a world. And of course, if that's Lewis's worldview, that's the perspective, that's the lens, the narrative lens that you have, that you see the world with. And every writer does that. Every writer, every one of these great franchises and stories we're talking about, they all do it. And I think it's just learning to recognize that can truly be a beautiful thing.
Absolutely. One of the things I think is kind of an interesting aspect of both of their stories is the understanding of the will.
Yeah.
So for Edmund, it was an action of his will to kind of make these choices that he did.
Right.
Right. And so for Frodo, it was also an action of the will. And for Gollum is a good character for that, right?
Gollum is we haven't talked about him. What a great character.
The things that he became, right?
Yes.
Those were his...
Another character who lost something.
Right.
And
out of choice.
Yes.
And that is really important for both of them. Throughout all of their writings, that choice is really important, and that they have this choice and that they're choosing things. And it's an act of the will. Mm-hmm. And I bring that up because it's interesting as you're getting to work stories of our time, and they don't view it that way.
Right.
We view things very differently.
Sure.
Right. I haven't seen it, but the Joker, you've seen the Joker, right?
Yeah, which we never got to talk about that actually on our hour-and-a-half Batman episode. We never got to it.
I imagine from the trailers, and this is a bad thing to do, but I imagine from the trailers that they paint it in a way that it wasn't always a choice of the will, but that it was to some degree things that have happened to him.
Right.
Right?
Right.
That's pretty common for the last even 50 years.
Yes.
That it's the things that have happened that have made you this person.
Yeah.
But Lewis and Tolkien don't see it that way.
That you have to make a choice, in other words, to be a certain kind of person.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's why, I think we can allow certain things to define us. That could be, we could leave it at that. Or we could say, there's a preferred, we talk about this in narrative practices all the time. There's a preferred narrative I want to live by. There's a preferred identity that I want to be in. And I have to decide and make choices in that. So
that's the choice of the will, right?
Yeah. So,
but it's hard.
Yeah, of course it's hard. And that's why, we can look at things that have happened to us and we can let that inform us. But we don't have to let it define us.
Absolutely.
We should probably start wrapping this thing up here, because we're just having a lot of fun with this. But we could talk about this all day, I know.
Oh, absolutely.
But okay, so when we think about, kind of maybe our favorite moments, or a couple of our favorite like stories or moments, I've already mentioned, for me, I love Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe. It's hard to top that story. I really like Magician's Nephew. I'm a sucker for creation stories. I love Voyage as well, because what I really love about Voyage of the Dawn, these are probably my top 3 Narnia books. Sure. Although I will say that The Last Battle is severely underrated.
Oh, it's good.
And
it has one of my favorite images.
Oh my gosh. Which one?
Well, further up and further in.
Oh yeah.
Right? Like they're just running
and it was, oh my gosh. Oh, so this is a spoiler alert if you've never read it. But like, it was super dark at the end when I realized like, you're all in a plane crash and you're all dead. I was like, what?
Yeah.
You just killed off your whole cast.
Absolutely.
Oh, that's like, oh man. That's like if Endgame, it was just like, let's kill off all 6 original Avengers.
But for Lewis, that's not the end.
I know, and that's what's so cool about the further up, further in imagery. Going back to Voyage, though, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. It's my favorite, like, probably, like, group of people, like, in the story, like, in terms of character dynamics. Like, I love, Lucy and the innocence of Lucy, but I also like how Lucy gets tested a little bit in it. And I love Edmund, who's not perfect still, but he's come a lot further. Eustace is kind of like our wild brat, spoiled brat who needs to undergo a conversion of sorts, and his whole thing of becoming a beast, right? He loses his humanity when he sees the gold. It very much reminds me in The Hobbit of Smaug, that encounter with the dragon. But we see Eustace, he becomes that thing. He puts the gold on, and it's not until Aslan comes that he can have his humanity back. And I love like Rippacheep, and just that he's a very layered character with a great mouse of fiction, and Caspian. And I just love the whole like kind of like episodic, like we just got to go to these islands. And why do we need to help these 7 people? Because it's the right thing to do. And it's just like, let's go. There's people who are lost. We need to go find them. That's all the story is. Yep. And how cool is that as a metaphor for life? Like there's people out there in the world that are lost. Let's go find them. And some of them can be saved and some of them can't be saved, which is really powerful in and of itself. And they all face their own trials along their way. All the different islands, it's so creative, what happens on them. So those are like my favorite Narnia books and moments. And in terms of Lord of the Rings and Hobbit, like I just love Hobbit's so much fun. It is. I don't know how you feel about the movies, but the Hobbit movies.
Oh, I'm not a fan.
But yeah, I feel like you could have just made either 1 or 2 really good movies rather than stretching them out over 3. But like the movies, like I like the goblin sequence, in the books with the goblins, and I love the stuff with Smaug and the cave and all that. And obviously the initial stuff with Gandalf there with all those hobbits in the hut, and there's just so much good stuff there. But yeah, and then you can't beat the ring getting thrown into the Sam and Frodo, and so yeah, but that's obviously like who doesn't love that?
Absolutely, they're great. So I think my all-time favorite Lord of the Rings moment is when Sam carries Frodo up.
Yeah. Oh gosh, so good.
I cry.
Yeah.
To be honest, I literally cry for that. And Sam,
it's moving.
Yeah, he's just so wonderful. I mean, it goes to speak about Lewis and Tolkien's bond as well, as that they view friendship so important.
Yeah.
That you need other people to get you through this.
Right.
And well, it is just, it's hard for me to top that image.
Yeah.
Like I said, further up and further in, going, the end of Narnia, it's so wonderful. When they meet Aslan, I mean, when they talk about this lion who is good but not safe, or I don't remember which story it is, but the girl sees him in the wood and she's like terrified of this
is that
lion.
Horse and His Boy?
I think it might be.
Yeah.
I'm notoriously
she doesn't know who
bad
he is.
at remember which part is from which story. But
right, yeah.
That is just such a great image. Lewis is really good at painting these pictures.
Yes. Right? One of the best. One of the best.
Tolkien's great at building this world.
Building worlds. Yep, agreed.
Lewis paints these little portraits.
Yep,
so
totally.
Well.
Agreed.
Oh my gosh. I mean, they're dramatic.
Yeah.
They're dramatic and they're fun.
Yeah.
Wow.
I wish, because of that, what you just said with the images there, like, I think Lord of the Rings has done, like, despite the Hobbit movies' flaws and failures, I think the Lord of the Rings trilogy, you're never going to top a film version of that. Movies, yeah. But I love the first Narnia movie to death, and that's about it. I really wish the passion that went into that first Narnia movie could have been put into more. You know, I still to this day have not seen Voyage of the Dawn Treader because I refuse to get my heart broken. Because that's in my top 3 favorite Narnia books. Yeah. And I just don't want to see it get butchered. Yeah. So I know Netflix is coming out with a series. I'm really hoping they nail these books the way they did with like a series of unfortunate events.
We'll see.
I hope they do them well.
Amazon's doing more Lord of the Rings stuff.
How do you feel about that?
I imagine it won't be that great. I'm sure it'll be beautiful and like the artistry of it. Right, like they'll probably paint this world wonderfully.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine they will get the depth of Tolkien's emphasis on Christianity.
Yeah, that's my biggest fear too, is that those themes and ideas would go under the wayside.
Which is fine if you don't agree with him.
Right.
But his work that's his work.
Right. And I'm hoping with Narnia that since the Lewis estate was very particular about Narnia and how the rights were going to be distributed, and now Netflix has the sole rights, I'm really hoping there's something in the conversation that will go well.
Yeah. Did you see the movie The Green Knight came out in the last couple of years?
No.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
No.
Oh, it's this medieval poem.
Okay.
Sir Gawain and the Green Knight.
Okay.
And so they just came out with this movie, and I was super excited because I remember reading the poem in high school. And
yeah.
It's like an Arthurian legend.
Okay.
And I was hesitant, but the trailers look good and stuff.
Yeah.
And I watch it, and it's beautiful.
Yeah.
I mean, like they did a great job in that, but the morals of the story are just stripped away, which is, you know what? I know that, and I didn't expect them to do that right, but that's kind of how I feel about The Lord of the Rings.
Yeah.
I think it'll be a beautiful world, but I think they'll strip away that depth.
Yeah. At least we'll always have those movies.
Absolutely.
So let's close with this. So we always like to talk about in these Why We Love episodes, how do these stories of fiction impact the real world, real life stories that we live in our day-to-day lives? So in other words, how do they inspire us to live a meaningful story? Because the stories that you consume and the stories you surround yourself with, they do impact you. They do influence you, whether you realize it or not. So if you could, Ryan, either from Tolkien or from Lewis's world, or a little bit of both, how do these stories help you? Influence you, inspire you to live a life worth living?
Well, that's what we've talked about already.
Yeah.
It's this idea of making the right choices, of choosing the will. They both have been tremendously influential on me on that. I can't distinguish who is more influential.
Sure.
But this idea that, where am I headed? Keep that in mind.
Yeah.
What's the journey look like? Mm-hmm. And where do I want it to go?
Yeah, I like that.
Those are important things.
Yeah.
It's easy to go down the wrong path unless you have a vision for where to go. Mm-hmm. And so
that's good.
That really helps me to make the choices of thy will to keep on.
Yeah.
How about you?
Obviously the image of the ring, finding out what your ring is. Like, what is that thing which is pulling you in, pulling you into the darkness and exposing that which you need to deal with in your life. For Lewis and for Narnia, I'll actually read an excerpt of this passage. So a couple of years ago, if anyone listens to my other podcast that I hosted, Life in the Gray, you would know that in 2020, I had a bit of an up and down kind of faith crisis. And we go through these valleys in our faith, And I actually read The Silver Chair that year as I was experiencing all this doubt and this, just this disillusionment with Christianity and whatnot. This really floored me, and almost like I didn't see this passage coming at all, because I read it as a kid, but I didn't remember this part and the weight of it. But it's towards the end of the book, and you've got this witch who's been seduced, in a way, kind of seducing the prince, right? Where he ties him to the silver chair every night and all that. But you've got Eustace and Jill that are here, and the witch is trying to lure them into this kind of trance. And the witch is essentially telling them, like, and I'll read it right here, "Come all of you, put away these childish tricks. I have work for you all in the real world. There is no Narnia, no Overlord, no sky, no sun, no Aslan. And now to bed all, and let us begin a wiser life tomorrow. But first to bed, sleep, deep sleep, soft pillows, sleep without foolish dreams." And they're almost pulled in, they're almost seduced by that, right? They're almost pulled into that, because it sounds, the whole argument, it sounds very convincing. And Puddleglum, who is like the most jaded, cynical creature in all the Narnia books, he puts his hand in the fire and he wakes up out of this trance, which is an interesting image in and of itself. But then he says this, which is probably one of my favorite passages, but it's probably the passage that most inspires me in this series, where he says to the witch, "One word, ma'am. One word. All you've been saying is quite right. I shouldn't wonder. I'm a chap who always liked to know the worst and then put the best face I can on it. So I won't deny any of what you said, but there's one thing more to be said, even so. Suppose we have only dreamed or made up all those things. Trees and grass and sun and moon and stars and Aslan himself. Suppose we have. Then all I could say is that in that case, the made-up things seem a good deal more important than the real ones." And he goes on to say, "We're just babies making up a game, if you're right. But four babies playing a game can make a play world which licks your real world hollow. That's why I'm going to stand by the play world. I'm on Aslan's side, even if there isn't any Aslan to lead it. I'm going to live as like a Narnian as I can, even if there isn't any Narnia." And that image there is what got me through those really hard seasons. And when I faced those hard seasons, because I had to eventually ask myself the question, if there is no Jesus or no God, if there is no heaven, no afterlife, no eternity, is the life that I'm living still worth it? Is the things that Jesus stands for still worth standing for? And when you're in those very dark places and your head gets cluttered with theology and deep questions about life, and I'm not sure what to make of this, you have to come back at the end of the day and ask yourself, is the true myth here? Is this where I find what life is all about? And that, I think, really is what Lewis and Tolkien help people do so well, is that no matter what sort of deconstructions and things we go through in our lives and in our faith journeys, we ask ourselves, but is the story still true? Even if I don't know historically how it all pans out, even if I don't know all the ins and outs of how God threw this all together and how it works, even if I am going to criticize the Bible and try, wrestle through the tough passages and whatnot, is the story true on that deeper level? And that's what gets me through the hard things in life. And so I always think about, no matter how jaded and cynical you are, like Puddleglum, even somebody like that is able to see the true myth as real.
Thanks, Derrick.
Yeah, thank you, Ryan. Any final thoughts before we close out?
So many.
Anything you want to leave the listeners with?
Yeah. I think that as you come to loosen Tolkien, they will force you to think about your life.
Yeah.
Think about your worldview.
Yeah.
They challenge you to that.
Yeah.
And that is one of the great things about them. Mm-hmm. You know what? You can be critical of them, but they're going to make you work for it.
Yeah.
Which is important.
Yeah.
Right? As you're talking about coming into these dark moments in life, you're challenging things. They're going to make you work for it.
Yeah.
And I think that would help so many people if they were willing to work for it. And particularly Lewis is a great person to help you with that.
Yeah. So good. Mm-hmm. Ryan, I can't thank you enough for being on here. This was a blast. We could do this for hours. I still haven't even finished my Guinness because I'm just having such a good time talking.
I can't say the same, but thanks for having me, Derrick.
I'll probably go finish it and head off to bed. But yeah, this has been wonderful. So thank you so much again, Ryan. And we'll be back next month with another Why We Love. We'll go back to superheroes now. So we transitioned from fantasy to another superhero. But I won't tell you who it is. It'll be a surprise. But I'll give you a hint. It's somebody who it's their 60th anniversary. So big deal, big deal. But yes, so thank you for being here. And if you love talking about stories and all this good stuff, my workshop, Live a Meaningful Story, is the place for you to be. So feel free to inquire at allthingsnarrative.com about booking a workshop for your group or for your teenagers in your after-school program or your youth group. And, if you want to talk more specifically about the stories of Lewis and Tolkien and what that means for your life, let's do something. Let's collaborate on that. So that's what we're here for at All Things Narrative, is to bring these connections together with the stories we love and the stories we live. And until next time, this is your friendly narrative practitioner signing off. Thank you and take care.